Welcome to the Mises Institute's podcast. We have a very special guest today, Lew Rockwell, who's the president and founder of the Mises Institute and my boss and the boss of everyone else in this office. We're very pleased to have him. He just got back from a lecture, a speech, and of all places, Washington, D.C. So it occurred to us that this would be a perfect time for his podcast debut. What took you to Washington, Lew?
Let me just say I apologize, first of all, for the cold I've got. I picked up a bug in Washington, I guess, but so if my voice sounds a little bit odd, that's the reason. But Dr. Ron Paul asked me to come and give a talk, rather his Liberty Study Committee, which is his organization that attempts to bring together libertarian-minded congressmen, of which there are a few, for common goals legislatively and social friendship. And so I went and first of all had a dinner meeting with Dr. Paul and his staff, his terrific staff, all very smart kids, very libertarian, very well read, just a great bunch of young people. And Ron and his wife Carol were there. This was at the Capitol Hill Club, which is a sort of slightly chilling official Republican club. And I must say, I definitely felt I was in I don't know, a nightclub in Mordor or something when I was in this place, because everybody else looked like a crook. I mean, they looked either like a crook or a war criminal. And I expected to see John Charles Houston or some of the guys from the old days, the ones who did the Nixon surveillance plans and plans for setting up dictatorships and so forth. I mean, they all looked awful, and except, of course, the Ron Paul people. And it had been some time since I've been in this club. The last time I was there was during Ronald Reagan's first term, so that's a long time ago. So we had dinner with the staff and with two of Ron's friends, Congressman Walter Jones from North Carolina, who was the man who went down in history, I guess, for having said we should no longer call French fries, but call them freedom fries. And today has changed his mind, realizes that, of course, all patriotic Americans need to eat everything French. I mean, French wine, French food of every sort to support the French.
Really, that much of a switch? I mean, really?
No, I'm teasing.
Oh.
But I mean,
that's quite a conversion.
No, but what he's entirely switched on is the war and the police state, the war on terrorism, the war in Iraq. So quite tremendous. And then also Congressman Jimmy Duncan from Tennessee. I had known his dad a little bit. In fact, in the mid-1970s, went to England with him and a few other congressmen to look at the National Health Service, socialized medicine, which, of course, we've now pretty much copied the English here in this country. And this was a guy who voted against the war in the beginning, and got in a huge amount of trouble in his district. Although he told me that now people come up to him and his wife and congratulate them for having made the right decision.
So when you say libertarian-minded, do you mainly talking about the war? Is that what does it mean to be libertarian-minded?
No, I'm talking about a broad range of things. First of all, a decentralist approach. These are all guys who think that there's something wrong with the federal government running all of the world, just from an institutional standpoint. They also are anti-tax. They're anti-spending. I wouldn't call them. They're not sort of members of the libertarian movement in any sense, much to their credit probably. But they're tend to be sort of old-fashioned small government conservatives.
Well, they seem to be popping up in strange places. I mean, are there surprises? I mean, in the 90s, you sort of knew who the libertarians were. At least we thought we did. Nowadays, it's slightly different, right? When you're talking about people who don't expect Washington to be running the world, are you talking about Republicans mainly, or
these
Democrats?
are all Republicans that I met.
These are all Republicans. Okay.
For example, Roscoe Bartlett, who I think of as just a sort of a traditional conservative, and it was at a luncheon that the next day that Ron had some of these congressional friends of his in to talk with me about the gold standard, about the war, about whatever else they wanted to talk about. He said, we were talking about socialized medicine. He said, the federal government took a problem that was a problem for a few people in the 1960s, that is a problem of not being able to afford medical care or other kinds of related questions. He said, made it into a problem a huge problem for every single American with Medicare and Medicaid. And he said this is the model of what they've done. So when you have a sort of a regular conservative talking like that, I would say to some extent these people are becoming radicalized. Now, it's only a few of them. And then, of course, there's all kinds of other great news. I mean, DeLay being shown up for the crook he is. Jack Abramoff, who I know a little bit, a Republican lobbyist crook, who's involved with a whole bunch of other congressmen. Very interesting stuff going to be happening there. The hilarious case of Randy Duke Cunningham, the loudmouth warmonger from San Diego, who it turned out had taken a Rolls Royce, a Louis Philippe commode. I don't know what a Louis Philippe commode is.
Sounds desirable.
A yacht. I mean, just a whole. Was it Michael Kinsley referred to it as a hilarious cornucopia of baubles that he had received. But anyway, the next day had this meeting, and they came, a bunch of them, maybe 7 or 8 of them, came in for at least part of the time, a luncheon, and it was very, very nice. And it's nice to see. I mean, it's funny that Ron Paul, certainly in the early years that he was up there, it was all very much of a matter of 434 to 1 votes in the Congress. Mm-hmm. Ron was pretty much alone. I would say it's a very different thing today. Without having changed his views, really, it's really the power of truth. I mean, the fact that he has continued for all these years to say the same sorts of things, stand up for the same sorts of principles against the Federal Reserve, against government spending, against wars, and so forth. It really has gotten him a lot of respect. So you have an amazing number of people who will come up to him and ask him to explain things, or why are you voting this way? And he's got a number of congressmen who have openly associate themselves with him and call him our leader. So it's neat. Now, this is still a tiny minority, of course, but it still is still fun to see it. It was one of the encouraging things about being in that awful city.
But do you think that the Bush administration is, in a sense, forcing Republicans to choose between
I beg your pardon. Well,
principle and politics?
Excuse me. I think that what we're actually seeing, and I was, as you know, we live under the biggest, richest, most powerful government in the history of the world by many magnitudes, and because of that, we're sort of living in an unfortunate social experiment. They can't do anything. They can't do anything right. Because of the nature of bureaucracy, because of the nature of socialism. This thing is the most incompetent bunch of boobs and thugs ever to be assembled in probably the history of the galaxy, let alone the world. So they can't go Hurricane Katrina right. They can't do the trial of Saddam Hussein right. They can't do the war right. Here they put through, I saw, for example, this World War II memorial, the ugliest looking thing you've ever seen on the mall. They can't do a memorial to themselves right anymore. They can't. You look at this new drug welfare program that Bush is spending, $1 quadrillion for the drug companies on. Nobody can figure it out. They're like 84 extremely complicated choices. Older people, everybody is hating the guts of the government, including those getting the government's money. So when you see this city as a symbol of the federal government, they can't do anything. I mean, they're paralyzed, and it again has to do with the nature of bureaucracy, and so it's a sort of a teaching moment for us and a very interesting opportunity. But it's having an effect even internally. Also, the corruption is having an effect internally, because the congressmen who are not corrupt are very much bothered by the fact that the leadership is all corrupt, and I was reminded that Jim Wright, who was the Democratic speaker who was tossed out by Newt Gingrich, his crime, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, was having a friendly trade union buy $48,000 worth of his book and distribute them to people. Shouldn't have done it, right? So Jack Abramoff, just on one Indio casino deal alone, has made $90 million. So there's a lot. And, of course, that's just a tiny bit of it. Some people are doing very well because of it, but I think the decent Republicans are worried about the corruption thing. They're also worried about losing the House. I mean, a lot of them fear that the coming election, because of the war especially, that they're all going to pay the price.
Yeah. Wouldn't you, maybe you would expect to see corruption increase as a party expects to lose power? I mean, if they expect that everything's going to turn at the next election, why wouldn't you right now take all you can get?
Sure, that's of course Hoppe's point, right? I mean, that's the nature of democracy.
Yeah.
But I guess it really began, at least with the Republicans, when they came to power. I mean, especially now that they have all power, they have the judiciary, the presidency, and the Congress, and so some of them are definitely living it up. But that has an effect on the decent people, even if they're not our kind of people ideologically. It bothers them. So, and also and it's not just the Republicans. I mean, there are both conservative Republicans and liberal Republicans who are sort of part of the Ron Paul network, and also some Democrats. So, it's very encouraging. People are sort of being educated. It's an interesting example of, I mean, Ron's never had political power in the real sense, and he never will have real political power, and probably in this world anyway. But he still has a huge influence, and again, it's sort of even though he's in politics, he's using his political office to educate people, not only his constituents, people all over the country, and even people in Washington.
Did you get any sense from anybody you talked to about you? I mean, did people say, "Oh, you're Lew Rockwell"? My goodness. I mean, do people know?
Well, a number of these congressmen. In fact, every one of them all read Mises.org and LewRockwell.com.
Yeah.
And at first I thought, well, they've just been well briefed and they're flattering me. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, they have no reason to try to flatter me.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, it must be true.
Yeah.
And they mentioned various articles, and they all get the daily article.
Yeah.
And also these guys are all well read. That's certainly not true of everybody in politics.
They're intellectuals.
They're all smart.
Yeah.
I mean, they were all smart. They were different, very interesting, different kinds of personalities, all smart and all well read. So, it's great that the daily article's penetrating into Capitol Hill.
Did you speak? You spoke at that luncheon. What did you speak about?
Well, I thought that I was going to give a talk.
Oh.
As it turned out, they really wanted to just have a Q&A session.
Oh, that's fun.
So I started off talking about the gold standard and war.
Yeah.
And maybe just because they're congressmen or whatever, they don't want to be addressed. Or maybe they get enough of that. I don't know.
What did you say about what is the relationship between gold standard and war?
Well, just that it's not a coincidence that the first central bank formed in the 1690s in England was set up specifically to allow the king to wage war on his own say-so and to circumvent the parliament. He didn't have to go to parliament anymore and ask for higher taxes, which was always very much of a problem for the king. So the central bank enabled him to circumvent that and, in effect, punish everybody through inflation, but enable him to wage his wars. And, of course, again, that our own Federal Reserve was set up right before our entry into World War I, enabling probably the greatest disaster in the history of the human race, World War I, to follow out as it did through U.S. intervention, leading eventually to World War II and to Hitler and Lenin, and what the deaths of 300 million people through government concentration camps and wars and oppression, starvations, and everything of every sort. So in some sense, maybe if we hadn't had the central bank, that all wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had Woodrow Wilson. So I just talked about, that in our own situation here recently, President Bush didn't have to worry about the budget.
Yeah.
It didn't really bother him whether his attack on Iraq was going to cost $5 billion or $50 billion or $500 billion. And man, they just printed it up at the Fed. Yeah. And of course, the new Fed governor, they're all interested in him, Ben Bernanke, and his specific lauding of the printing press. They were all very interested in the article that he'd had in the Wall Street Journal that day about the Great Depression, and a number of them pointed out that he obviously hadn't read Rothbard's book on the Great Depression.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, he takes the standard line that the Great Depression was brought on by deflation, and that the lesson from that is the Fed always needs to err on the side of running the printing press 24/7.
Yeah.
And he, in fact, has held this out as one of the great thing about the Fed. They can print as much money at virtually no cost as they need to.
It seems to be the neoclassical consensus at this point. It's like a combination of Keynes and Friedman or something. And it does seem like almost as if the Austrians are the only dissidence on this point, doesn't it?
No, it's true, and of course the whole, even the whole helicopter effect. I mean, that Friedman implying that somehow inflation takes place as if money dropped from a helicopter. Bernanke, some people call him helicopter Bernanke because of this point. But of course, as the Austrians know, that's not the way the new money comes in at all. It comes in through the banking system, and it's if in fact everybody's cash balances were increased at the same amount by the same time by the same percentage, they would have no reason to inflate. I mean, it's because some people are forced to pay more than others that, and some people get the new money first. This is why they inflate. That, and of course, in order for the reasons that any counterfeiter inflates to pay the bills.
Yeah. So
they're very interested in monetary questions, in the war questions, very worried about what's going to happen, worried about all of them. I must say were outraged by the attacks on Murtha. They all liked Murtha and thought he was a significant guy.
This is the
John Murtha, the congressman from Pennsylvania, who had said it was time to get out.
Right. The
war was lost. And when he said this, Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and all the rest of them immediately smeared him as a coward and a traitor and a bum and probably in the pay of Osama bin Laden. I'm kidding, of course, but that was sort of the implication. Right?
You're not for us, you're against us.
Well, yeah, I mean,
or whatever. You're for the enemy, I guess.
And one new Republican congresswoman referred to him as a coward for wanting to cut and run, leading to the shutdown of the House. I mean, all the Democrats were booing her, and they had to actually shut the thing down. And it's very funny. Of course, the White House, like all political operations, is doing flash polling every single night. And obviously their own polls must have told them this whole thing was a mistake, because the next day they're immediately saying, well, he's actually a great American and a great patriot and a veteran and so forth. And we should have a debate. It's okay to have differing views and so forth. There has, of course, never been a debate in Washington on this war. Yeah. The House and the Senate never held a debate on the war, ever. In fact, some of these guys are trying to do various parliamentary maneuvers to try to bring about a debate that involves pro-war people as well as anti-war people. But, of course, they don't want a debate for the fact that they've got nothing to say except you're a traitor for wanting to question me. And
at some level it's just outrageous, though, isn't it? I mean, how long has the war been going on now? Very long time. And for people to be only now insisting, that the thing be debated and that some decisive action be taken to rectify what are obvious injustices. I mean,
of course it's true, but it's the whole point of one of the great things about a war from the state standpoint is they get to shut everybody up.
Yeah.
That saying anything counter to the official line makes you a traitor. Also, I just want to mention one other thing Murtha said that I think set them back after Cheney went after him as a traitor and a bum and a terrorist, pro-terrorist, and so forth. He said he didn't like being instructed by a guy who'd taken 5 deferments during Vietnam about who should be going to get killed in the war, and telling him who a guy who'd actually been over there. So I think that also shut down the critiques in a way that they don't want the whole hilarious chicken hawk thing addressed. That all these guys were very careful. And by the way, I have absolutely no problem with Cheney taking 5 deferments. He should have taken 55. Or fine for Bush not to want to go to Vietnam. That's all makes a lot of sense. The problem is, of course, it's like Rush Limbaugh. They want to send other young people to kill and be killed where they themselves wouldn't do it and force them into it, just like Limbaugh wants to put people who use drugs into prison, whereas he himself, of course, feels that he should be able to use drugs and nothing would happen to him. So the fact these people are all such hypocrites is it's actually helpful. So.
But did you say anything that rattled anybody at that Q&A session?
Well, I think I was more radical than any of them, but that's that's why I was there,
sure.
Right? I mean, I'm not there so that I'm for a gold coin standard, and while they're all for less inflation, and except with the exception of Ron Paul, and I'm for I think the only thing we can do in Iraq is stop doing evil things. There's actually nothing good to be done. All we can do is get out. We can't actually fix the place. We can't stop a civil war from happening, which is happening right now anyway. I think not at all unhappy. The U.S. not at all unhappy with that. But that we just have to stop doing bad things. That's the only thing that we can look to the government to do, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's with the Federal Reserve, whether it's with regulation or spending, taxation, whatever. We should never look to them. In fact, this was the subject of a talk that I later gave the same day to congressional aides. We can't look to the government to try to plan our freedom for us, to try to impose freedom on us through some sort of public policy trick. That all we can hope to do is to have them stop doing bad things.
But your comment implies that what seems to be the case, the biggest reservation about an immediate pullout is precisely that people worry that all of Iraq will just collapse into just uncontrollable chaos, and this would spread and would result in mass violence, and the U.S. would somehow catch the blame for this. So your comment then addresses that point, that you don't think that will be the result, or there's nothing we can do to...
Well, I don't. There is mass violence. There is mass chaos. People are still, everybody's unemployed. There's, of course, a huge regime of price controls and other kinds of interventions the U.S. has put into place in Iraq. There's still gasoline price controls. So they've got long lines to get gasoline. Here's a country that's one of the second only to Saudi Arabia for its known oil reserves. There's a shortage. They've created a shortage of gasoline.
It's a lot like the Soviets in Afghanistan, isn't it?
Well, and one of the, of course, there's an underground economy, and one of the things a lot of young boys do is they get these jerry cans that hold 5 or 10 gallons of gasoline, very heavy, of course, fill them up and through an underground network and go around and sell it to cars waiting in line or whatever. So one of the things the U.S. does is arrest these kids. The soldiers arrest these kids for the economic crime of selling gasoline outside the approved system. Well, it's definitely Soviet.
Yeah.
And of course, the soldiers, it's not their idea. They're being told what to do. But the whole, the whole thing is a disaster. So we can stop killing people. We can stop having our troops killed. I think that's about all we can do. Is there going to be a civil war? There may be. I don't know. It's the fact that the U.S. has set up, in effect, a Kurdish/Shiite government that's going after the Sunnis for the things they feel the Sunnis did to them in past years. That's already happened. Most of the violence, of course, in Iraq is directed at the U.S. as the occupiers. If we got out, that would end.
Yeah.
What else would happen, we don't know. But probably half people are unemployed. Half the people who like jobs can't get jobs. There's no electricity. The whole thing is very, very bad. None of the oil is being produced. We've made in Tacitus's phrase, we've made a desert and called it peace. We've made a desert and called it freedom. But it's not. So, and of course the answer is also not foreign aid, as some liberals think. Foreign aid is also itself, of course, an imperial action.
Yeah, they don't seem to understand that.
It's actually that's the U.S. controlling things for the benefit of the U.S. state, its puppets in Iraq, big business in this country and favored business interests in Iraq, ripping off the American people and ripping off the Iraqi people. We don't want foreign aid there or anyplace else. So it's true bad things may happen, but I don't think we can buy the stupid Colin Powell analogy that he refers to as the pottery barn rule, that if you break it, you own it. First of all, that's not the pottery barn rule. They don't actually, that's not the way Pottery Barn runs its business. But I always think of, if it's a case of, it's always useful to put these things on a more local level. If the police end up wrecking somebody's house looking for a criminal, and maybe they capture the criminal and they wreck the house, then they own the house? And they can tell you how to live, and the other people in the house, no, you can't. That's just ridiculous. All we can do is stop doing evil. That's internationally or domestically. There may very well be more bad things to happen in Iraq. But let's look at what the U.S. has already achieved in Iraq in terms of bad things through our intervention. First of all, there was President Bush the first attack on Iraq. We don't know how many civilians killed, probably 100,000 civilians killed. Then he imposed the starvation blockade that Clinton then continued. 12 years. We don't know how many people were killed. During the Clinton years, Madeleine Albright admitted that the figure was probably 500,000 children and old people killed by starvation. She said it was worth it in an attempt to overthrow Saddam. The thing went on much longer. Some people think maybe 1 million people were killed by our starvation blockade. And it's not often talked about, but right at the end of the first Gulf War, the U.S. deliberately bombed every single sewage treatment plant in Iraq, and then forbade any chemicals, chlorine, other chemicals, water purifying chemicals from being imported into the country, deliberately attempting to cause disease. And there were cholera outbreaks and horrible. So a lot of people died. The U.S. government did that. Now, again, we've had at least 100,000 innocent civilian casualties, and not to speak of obviously the insurgents who were killed, the American soldiers who were killed. There's a whole mountain of skulls the U.S. has created in Iraq. So the idea that this same bunch should be able to stay there to make things better, I think it's just implausible, and really we just have to get out.
And that would go, you believe that, too, concerning various plans. It seemed somewhat plausible to divide the country up, split it up into various pieces.
Well, that may very well happen, right?
But but it should just happen. It
I think, it should not up to us to decide, because there'd be the U.S., tougher sometimes people understand, the U.S. is not a charitable institution, the U.S. government. Yeah. So that even though it might be claiming to break up the country and, for freedom or whatever, there would be various other things happening in terms of the U.S. wanting to have control. We also have to relinquish all the military bases we've got there. The first act of the Coalition Provisional Authority after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was to sign an agreement between itself and the U.S. government, as if these were two different entities, setting up 14 huge permanent U.S. military bases in Iraq forever. So this is one of the reasons, of course, the Iraqis don't believe that the U.S. intends to ever get out, they would believe the U.S. intends, this is why the insurgents believe that the U.S. intends to be there permanently. And these bases are being built by Halliburton right now and similar military contractors. Some of them are thousands of square miles. So these are huge, we need to stop it. So it may very well be that there should be 3 different countries. Maybe it should be 33 different countries. I don't actually know. I'm all for breaking it up. I think that's a great thing. On the other hand, it's not really true that Iraq was formed by the British Empire. I mean, that region of the world, which is pretty much equivalent to Mesopotamia, has been a coherent region for many thousands of years. So maybe it wouldn't break up. Maybe it would break up. Maybe there would be several Kurdish states. Maybe there'd be several Shiite states. Maybe I don't know, maybe the Sunnis and the Shiites would end up being together. Who knows? I mean, a very interesting figure, Muqtada al-Sadr, who is, even though he's a Shiite, is very much an Iraqi nationalist and wants and rejects sort of religious, even though he's a religious leader himself, rejects religious bias in the new government and wants actually a more secular government. So there's all kinds of interesting things. The one thing we can be sure of, we don't know anything. None of us know anything about Iraq, none of the history of Iraq, the tribal questions, ethnic questions, religious questions. They're all, and it's not just, of course the Kurds are Sunnis. I mean, the Kurds they're ethnically different. They're not Arabs, but they're Sunni Muslims. So anyway, there are all kinds of very interesting degrees of complexity that absolutely no American knows anything about.
And none of which seem to have occurred at all to the Bush administration when they first went in there. They seem to accept the line from some of the Iraqi dissidents that all you'd have to do is go in and get rid of the dictator, and then peace and freedom for all would just break out immediately.
Well, I know they said that. I don't think they actually believe that. I think that they have. I think that these people, and we think of them as neoconservatives, which is sometimes a useful term, have an almost religious belief in the ability of force to accomplish things. Yeah. They believe that put the gun to the guy's head and everything will be okay. Bombs and bullets will shape society exactly as they want it to be shaped. And that's what they thought would do it. So that was, I think, the great illusion. I think that was just propaganda for the American people to get us into the war. No conquered people throws flowers in the feet of the conqueror. It just doesn't happen. People don't want to be ruled by foreigners. Even if one might say from some other perspective that some of the former British colonies were better off being run by the British than by their local leaders, in one sense, but people don't want that. Here we are in Alabama, and I think, let's say, a country that were freer than in the United States, Switzerland or Hong Kong or Singapore, whatever, conquered Alabama and was going to fix us up and make us freer, and we certainly could be a lot freer. What would the average, and then of course, in these cases wouldn't necessarily, if it's say Switzerland, wouldn't be the case where we would have people who are as foreign as we are in Iraq, linguistically, religiously, ethnically, and historically, and every other sense foreign. But let's say we had English-speaking Swiss people came here and were running Alabama. Would the average young Alabama guy, who's of course well armed as a hunter and otherwise, would he be saluting and doing what the Swiss said, or would he be heading to the woods and taking pot shots at them? I think we know the answer to that. That's the way human beings are, and I don't agree with that. I don't think that. I wish that the people in Iraq were using a nonviolent form of resistance. I don't like the fact that they're. It's not good in many different grounds to be killing people. It's not a good thing. But that's the way people react. People don't want to be governed by foreigners. That's why colonialism is one of the reasons colonialism doesn't work. Maybe you could say that the English did a better job of running India than certainly the Indians until the present time, socialist Nehru and maybe the Maharajas before. Maybe in some sense the English were more progressive in a good sense. They stamped out the Thuggee cults of where you had a religion that would kill people, pick up travelers, and kill them as a religious rite for the goddess Kali. Well, the British got rid of that. But still the Indians like to be run by themselves. They don't want guys from London telling them what to do. And that's human beings. So the Iraqis don't want us telling them what to do. People in Alabama wouldn't want the Swiss telling them what to do. In fact, those of us in Alabama don't want Washington telling us what to do, by the way, guys.
This relates to the topic of your talk later in the day.
Yeah, Ron also asked me to talk to congressional aides, so they sent out an invitation to the various offices, and virtually no Republican aides came. Very interesting. There were some outside visitors. Jim Bovard, the wonderful libertarian author, has got a new book coming out, was there, and other friends. But most of the congressional aides who were there were from Democratic offices. So some of them were greatly outraged to find out that I was opposed to welfare, for example. A couple of them stalked out of the room. But I would say most people were interested, and pretty much what I talked about was, the title of the talk was The Impossibility of Imposed Freedom, and that part of the right-wing response to the left obviously thinks you have to have total government control in order to prevent discrimination or poverty or unfairness and all the rest of the things they would talk about. But the Republicans do sometimes. The right seems to think that we need the government using market-based incentives to run the economy and society to fulfill the government's goals for us. Let's take, for example, the whole question of Social Security, a horrible program instituted by Franklin Roosevelt, based on the original horrible program instituted by Bismarck in Germany. Bismarck, sort of the Lincoln of Germany, a guy who crushed the freedom of the various German states, united them into a single state for war purposes. And one of the things he thought would help with this and help him circumvent the opposition of the left was to establish a welfare state. And one of his programs was Social Security. And Franklin Roosevelt, this was one of his New Deal programs, and thought this would be something that would permanently change America, that no future administration would be able to undo it, because it would be such an effective form of statism. And so far, of course, he's been proven right. The thing is a fraud. It's not. It uses the language of insurance, but it's simply a redistribution program. It's made us a much poorer people. It's set up all kinds of very bad incentives. It's promoted the rotten idea of retirement, the ridiculous, evil idea that men and women should stop working at age 65 and just vegetate on a golf course, and stop contributing to society as productive members of the economy and as leaders among among society. So this has been a terrible program. It's caused vast amounts of resources to be transferred from productive and investment uses in the economy into into consumption. It's made people feel that they don't need to provide for their old age because the government's going to take care of them. And so now we're starting to see, as the taxes go up and up, and there are fewer and fewer working people versus the people who are receiving Social Security, there comes a cry for reform. People realize that there has to be something done. So what do the Republicans and the DC types come up with? Well, let's have privatized Social Security, by which they don't mean, by the way, they've distorted the word privatization. They don't mean the idea of the government withdrawing from areas of the economy or society it's now controlling, but they mean the government running us in a new way for its own benefit. So the privatized Social Security, so-called, would have set up a whole new system of forced savings and enable the government to control the stock market to a greater extent than it does, to control all of our lives to a greater extent than it does, have vastly increased spending, vastly increased deficits in the name of freedom and privatization. In other words, just a lie and a crime. So this is the Republican response to the left-wing Social Security. Both are wrong, and all I've tried to make the point, that what I think is the Jeffersonian point, that liberty is not something to be imposed or given to us by the government, but is something that is natural. It's a natural right, and what we want is the government to not interfere with our liberties. That's what our focus has to be on. But we can't ever look to the government to give us freedom, because it won't give us freedom. It'll give us a counterfeit freedom. It'll give us a yoke with another name on it.
It does seem to be a critique of a certain brand of liberalism or neoliberalism, doesn't it? The Chicago School of Economics seems to think that you can kind of use the courts to establish a more perfect market economy, and there's so many proposals out there that you would have Congress pass this or that bill to secure private property rights from invasion, from local governments. These are the kinds of plans you're referring to, then.
Sure, and of course you're exactly right about the Chicago School, and we have a lot of libertarians sort of advocating that, in effect, a judge-ruled society, and the judges, in making use of the Chicago School idea, should define property rights, and as they think brings about efficiency, economic efficiency. Of course, as Austrians, we know that efficiency only has meaning in a subjective sense. I mean, what's efficient for the property owner? What do they want to do with their property? That's obviously the correct position morally, and it's also the correct position from a standpoint of general economic prosperity. But the idea that judges, notice it in common parlance too. I mean, some people think judges are not part of the government.
Yeah.
That they somehow stand apart from the government. Of course, they represent the government. They're part of the government. And Hans Hoppe's done some wonderful work on this to remind us that when you have the government, when you have an institution having a monopoly of justice, we've got problems. So it's why one of the things I tried to talk about was how wonderful the whole private arbitration movement is. In fact, private courts in so many states handling so many commercial disputes and bringing actual justices versus the government courts, leading, I must say, one young lady who was with Congressman John Conyers' office to stalk out of the room. One of the things they did was they gave out copies of Speaking of Liberty to any of the congressional aides who came, and she...
this is your book.
Yeah, she tossed back the book to the Ron Paul's aide who had given it to her and just sort of stalked out of the room. That would be it. So, on the other hand, I had one very interesting question from a young man from Congressman Wexler's office, and I congratulated him on being from Wexler's office, Wexler being one of the people who had really now taken a strong anti-war stance, one of the 3 people who voted to end the war immediately just recently. And so he, in his question, said, well, really, aren't you saying, and he said it seemed to him that was correct, that the real problem was the central government, and that we had less to fear from the states and the localities, and that maybe a decentralist approach was a better one. And this guy, by the way, is just, Wexler is sort of, I always thought of him anyway, as a typical Democratic liberal. I'm now going to have to examine him a little bit more on more than the war issue. But here was a Democratic liberal aide making a great old right Jeffersonian, old conservative libertarian point about the dangers of consolidated government. a point, unfortunately, very few Republicans of the non-Ron Paul sort would agree with.
At least not today, 10 years ago.
Yeah, but of course it was just a trick 10 years ago, right? Because Clinton was running the government.
Yeah.
So I think that, by the way, a lot of these, one of these congressmen from Idaho came in and was talking to me about, I just read a great book, Tom DiLorenzo's book on Lincoln. So, right, I mean, so he was just thrilled. I thought that was, and of course that's exactly right. And again, a reminder that, and I say this as somebody who was a Republican all his life, and now not associated with any political party, but the Republican Party was born in big government and big government, big business partnership and suppression of civil liberties and inflation and aggressive war and all protectionism and all the rest of the rotten aspects of the Lincoln government. And then we have McKinley and the war on Spain and the Taft and the income tax and the occupation, the colonial war against the people in the Philippines. We still to this day don't know how many. No American knows about this. Probably the U.S. government killed 200,000 Philippine civilians for the crime of wanting to run their own country. They didn't want to be run by Spain. There was a big revolt against Spain. They didn't want to be run by the Americans up there. And the U.S. It's where we got the whole program of strategic villages and concentration camps and the sense of prison camps. Just a horrific anti-guerrilla war in the Philippines, and the U.S. of course held the Philippines as a colony till the Japanese took it away, and then U.S. got it back, but then have to thank goodness let it go at the end of World War II. Filipinos didn't want to be run by the Americans any more than the Iraqis did. But this, unfortunately, the Republican Party, and then we think of Herbert Hoover, although I must say he was pretty darn good on foreign policy, but really started the New Deal, as Murray Rothbard showed so eloquently in his book on the Great Depression. So unfortunately, the Republican Party's got a bad history. Then there are great people as in opposition to Roosevelt, and of course Taft and the great Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's father, who was a congressman from Nebraska, opposed the Cold War, opposed the Korean War, friend of Murray Rothbard's. So they're great Republicans, but they've been in the minority, so I'm afraid that the Bush regime actually is the real Republican Party, not a...
but still, it's striking.
Any more than the Democratic Party is not the party of Jefferson, just in case anybody would think that was the case.
But 10 years ago, you're making a case against nation building internationally, nation building domestically too. But these same points were being made by all the anti-Clintonites.
I just saw a great quote from Tom DeLay the other day during the Bosnian War. And he's denouncing Clinton for not having set a timetable, and for not having an exit strategy, for not defining what victory is. When do you know you've accomplished what? All the kinds of questions that are, of course, considered Osama bin Laden-ish to ask today of the Bush government. These guys were all asking of Clinton.
Well, you'd think that you would hope that with the left studying the Bush administration so carefully, that the left would draw broader lessons from the experience, that you don't want a mega state with all of this power, because look what it can do to the country, look what it can do to the world. But for some reason, the right had the chance to learn that lesson from the experience of Clinton, and it didn't stick.
Yeah, it's true. I had a young man write me a few weeks ago and described himself as a left-winger and said that he was now beginning to question whether he really wanted the same government that was running the war in Iraq running him here at home.
Yeah, right.
And so I said, hooray, right? Yeah, that's really exactly right.
That's a good lesson.
But, no, I mean, the left, I was listening to, driving home last night from the airport, to Mike Malloy, who's a left-wing talk show host. Great stuff to say about the war. And then he went on in the most unbelievable, I would describe it almost like a Hitler-like or a Stalin-like attack on Walmart. It was just really, it was chilling. I mean, it sounded like, Pravda in the 1930s going after the wreckers. Just horrible. So, we have our work cut out for us in every sector, I guess.
Well, after being in Washington for a couple of days, did you have any regrets that the Mises Institute doesn't have Capitol Hill headquarters?
No. Well, first of all, of course, the city has become the... how shall I say, the concrete barrier capital of the world. I mean, all these former streets are shut off with guards and with barriers and course, the thing is, a cop afoot. I mean, all over Washington. I mean, they've expanded the Capitol Hill police by some unbelievable percentage, and I must say, it looks like they hired people for what a surprise on political reasons rather than, how shall I say this, rather than for reasons of ability to, say, chase somebody down. I mean, there are a lot of people who didn't seem like they had sort of the normal, what you would think of as the normal policeman body shape, who were just standing around and soaking up tax dollars and making trouble and stopping people, and the whole place is very unpleasant. And on the other hand, there's another unpleasant aspect to it. If you sort of in the outskirts of the district, vast building going on, vast shopping malls. And,
it's a boomtown, huh?
So, of course, they're sucking in all the money from the country and the world and living it up. I was put at the Pentagon Sheridan, where, as far as I could tell, I was the only non-CIA guy in the hotel. And right there is this huge Pentagon shopping mall. And they all are living very well. They live very well. It's the most prosperous part of the country. But, of course, they're all parasites. And it's one of the things we hope to do at the Mises Institute is try to protect and talk about the importance of the producers as versus the parasites, and businessmen as versus politicians. And but when you're in that place, it's the political capital. It's the capital of looting. It's the capital of the rip-off. It's the capital of the parasites. And it's really a very, very unpleasant place.
You know, did you have a sense when you were there that as you were saying these things, as you were speaking and talking to the audience, of general shock or relief to finally hear something that sounds a little different from what they might hear from day to day?
Well, I think they sort of knew they were going to hear something different. I would say some people were shocked, some people were interested, some people were glad to hear a different perspective. There were various. There were some conservative retired bureaucrats there from various agencies who all thought they were going to hear, I think, a simpatico presentation, and one of them was a big fan of distributivism, the economic ideas of Chesterton and Belloc, and were shocked to find out that they didn't hear a sympathetic presentation. So sort of the old. I remember some of the old conservatives. I remember from Washington. Doesn't mean they aren't fine people, but there's something bad about living off others by force. Has a bad effect on you.
Yeah.
So people have been lifetime bureaucrats. They may start out good. They may be still decent people. They're not beating their wife or robbing the bank or whatever. But still, there's a really, if we care for, if we exercise a form of Christian love towards the bureaucrats and want the best thing for them, we have to make them get a job. I mean, in effect, that's what I said to all these congressional aides: get a job, get off the payroll, become producers, contribute to society. Don't be parasites. So, people, I didn't put it in quite those terms, but that's in effect what I was saying.
But it's a strange aspect of Washington culture that people on the outside don't entirely understand, just how isolated sometimes it seems that people who live and work in Washington really are from any kind of productive activity, any kind of real-world setting. I mean, inside the Beltway does have its own kind of internal culture of isolated culture.
It does, and you get that when you look at the Washington Post, which is like a house organ, like a company house organ. I mean, it's very different from a regular newspaper. And looking at the Washington Post helps you remind you of this. And when I was flying home, I was sitting behind two people who were talking very loudly. One man who had some job at the White House, not a political job, but in some sense of I guess, was some sort of catering manager or something like that. And a woman worked for some other aspect of the government. And I remember they were saying to her, laughing, and said, well, we can sure agree the government exists for one purpose, to employ us.
Oh, really?
And she laughed. She said, that's right. And I didn't pour my Coke in their head or anything, right? I was good, but I thought that's, so they are, but it's definitely, they are very much apart. They're a very strange breed. And I've spent time in Washington. I had the honor of working for Ron Paul, and which was a great experience. But I was reminded of all the things that I dislike about Washington. It's been a long time since I've been there. It'll be a long time before I go there again. But they're happy to live off of us. It's not in their own interests, and so it's why, as libertarians, when we want to decrease the size of the government, it's really in all of society's interest, including the parasites.
Do you think it's extraordinary, given that at least according to the official statistics, the economy is not in terrible shape? Things are growing, the inflation is rising on the producer level, but it's not terrible on the consumer price level. The unemployment is low. That you would have the public opinion in polls so expressing such discontent right now with the federal government.
Yeah, I think, of course, part of it's the war, but I think it's because the economy is not actually as good as the statistics would lead you to believe. I mean, part of the statistics would tell us that the gross domestic product is increasing. It isn't that great, but of course, as we know, one of the problems with the GDP statistic is that as government spending increases, the GDP goes up, even though that's not only as Rothbard pointed out, not only an indicator of increased prosperity, it's an indicator of decreased prosperity. So when when New Orleans is destroyed and the government's going to rebuild it, that's considered economically a great thing from the standpoint of the GDP and people who pay attention to those statistics. It's actually a very bad thing. It's economically a bad thing. So it's not actually a good thing to destroy property, even though you're able to rebuild it. Has led to, and of course this is the constant Austrian message, that we're not paying attention to what might have happened to that money and those resources otherwise. So I think I don't agree with Paul Krugman on many things except the war, but he had a good column recently about median family income being down again. People are struggling. So even though the official employment statistics are looking pretty good, even though the official CPI statistics, which are also, I think, don't at all indicate what's actually going on. Any of us who go to do grocery shopping realize that prices are going up at a faster rate than the government claims they are. So I think people are picking up on this, and of course they're worried again about the future. They may have a job today, they're worried about maybe they don't have a job a year from now. And of course one of the things the Bush government has done by increasing the government in sort of LBJ FDR terms, I mean, the amount of increased spending has been just horrific. And even though they're all living it up in Washington, they're all having a great time. Fancy restaurants, mansions, they've all got limos, and it's a far wealthier area than, say, Beverly Hills or whatever. I mean, you can't believe it. They're all, and it's unlike Beverly Hills, entirely parasitic. So they're all doing great, but this is so destabilizing and destroys economic growth, destroys prosperity, everything the government is doing, and it's because it's stepped up things at such an amazing rate under in the Bush administration, the Republicans in power. I think people pick up on this, even though maybe it's just a feeling rather than knowledge. So I think they're right to be worried about the economic future. And then of course Bernanke, and we know what Greenspan has been doing to the money supply for his term. It's been Allen Printing Press Greenspan, and now we've got his disciple, Mr. Hyper Printing Press Bernanke. I think people are right to be worried. The government is doing very bad things. Of course, on the other hand, there's many magnificent things going on. Entrepreneurs are still doing wonderful things. Many American industries are growing and producing magnificent products. The constant battle of the market against the government. I think in many ways the market is winning, and certainly the market will win. But the government is capable of amazing damage, and they're doing damage right now, and I think people pick up on that.
I was going to say, when you're talking about positive things, the extraordinary growth of international trade and the expansion of the division of labor into China, Russia, Eastern Europe, hasn't that just been astonishing how wonderful that's been for international productivity and for trade, and far beyond, I think, probably what anybody really expected.
I mean, the entry of the Chinese people to the world economy has to be one of the great events in the entire history of the human race. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And then we have the Indian people brought in. They weren't kept out in the sense of communism, but they had a very rigid socialist system. They were kept out. Obviously, the peoples of Russia and Eastern Europe were kept out. They've all, to one extent or another, come into the world economy. Very good for them, very good for us. very good for the cause of freedom, for the cause of international amity.
Yeah.
So yes, it's just thrilling. And when you look at what's going on in China, you look at the Chinese cities, look like Houston and Dallas. What do you say about a country that within, when at the time when Nixon was going to China, had vast concentration camps, vast famines, and a horrible political regime, one of the worst, maybe the worst, one of the worst political regimes in the history of the world. Since then, to have developed a society that still is officially communist, but the corporate income taxes are 5%. That's my kind of communism, and they, the unbelievable prosperity. It's still a poor country overall, but nobody's starving. The concentration camps are gone. Still a long way to go, but it's been a tremendous. We see it every day when you go to Walmart or whatever. What the benefits of trade with China, and even from a political standpoint, the neoconservatives and the religious right were beating the drums for a new war with China just before 9/11. That was their preferred war of the moment. They couldn't get away with that, I think, because so many Americans have a stake in doing business with China, American businessmen and American consumers. And it's Bastiat's point, and Mises and other ones, that free trade, besides bringing increased prosperity, brings increased human friendship and is an anti-war device. So it's one of the reasons why those who advocate mercantilism and protectionism are not only wanting to make us poor and make other people poor, but are in effect promoting warfare and bombs and killing as versus human flourishing.
George Reisman went to China a few months ago and blogged a wonderful item on the topic that very much reflects exactly what you said. And he thought it was one of the great trips he had ever taken. If you had the chance to go speak in Beijing.
Hey, well, that would be great. In fact, I had an email from a man who was just there, and he said one of the extraordinary things to him were all the ads. He speaks Chinese. All the ads the hospitals had. Come to our hospital.
That's wonderful.
Best service, best prices, best doctors, and so best nurses, and so forth. You would never see that in this country because we still have a socialized medical system. China, because of the vast economic increase, they no longer have a socialized medical system of the form they used to have. It's pretty much a free system. If the higher reaches the government and so forth, they've still got socialized medicine. But the average Chinese businessman has nothing to do with the government medical system, has private doctors, private hospitals, and that sort of thing. And they advertise for customers. Not an amazing thing, actual capitalism. Thrilling.
Magnificent. I hope we don't have to wait till that trip for your next podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you.